how do you envision a future relationship between humans and nature?
So when we designed the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration strategy with the UN team, we were thinking about what should be at the heart of that decade. And it's actually not 1 billion hectares of restored landscapes. It's the repaired or the restored relationship between us and nature. We're in a relationship crisis. And if you're in a relationship crisis with nature, it's not only about what you do, it is also about how you think and how you feel and your attitude towards each other. So I think that shift in perception of our role is one of the next big steps in human evolution. Caring for the planet that until now has just cared for us and not the other way around, at least not very much. That is a big step in human evolution. That takes a collective humankind mind shift.
I'm Jessica Smith.
And I'm Diana Denke.
And this is Executives in the Wild, a podcast that interviews remarkable leaders and changemakers to understand why being connected to nature is so crucial to their happiness and professional success, and how it's helping them to make a positive difference in this world.
We want to showcase inspiring guests who have successfully integrated a connection to nature into their lives. We want to give our listeners a beacon of hope that there is a better way to lead in these uncertain times, one we can all lean into if only we dare to step into the wild. Welcome, Tim, to the podcast. Thank you for taking the time. Tim Christophersen has joined Salesforce as a VP of Climate Action in May 2022. Within the Global Impact team, he's focused on the role of nature-based solutions to climate change. Before joining Salesforce, Tim was head of the Nature for Climate branch at the United Nations Environment Programme and led a growing global movement backed by all UN member states and over 120 organizations to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystem worldwide, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration 2022-2030. Tim holds a degree in forestry and forest conservation engineering from Dresden University of Technology. He previously worked for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, where he led the portfolio on the conservation and sustainable use of forest biodiversity. From 2017 to 2019, he was elected chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration. From 2002 to 2007, he was regional program coordinator for Europe, the Caucasus, and the Commonwealth of Independent States at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. He has also worked for the Danish Ministry of the Environment and for the European Commission. What a background around nature conservation, Tim. He's based in Denmark. Please welcome him to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Tim, we're so glad to have you. It's really an incredible CV, as Diana said. It sounds like it started very early in your life, your love of nature, but walk us through a little bit more about yourself and when did your love of nature really start?
It indeed started early in my life. I grew up in a small village in northern Germany, and there was not a lot to do for kids other than roam around in nature. So I spent a lot of time fishing and running around in the forest. And then later with my grandfather, who was a forester, spending a lot of time in nature. And looking back, this is now quite a few years ago, but of course in Earth's timescales, this is absolutely not long ago. But within that time, I want to give you one example of what happened to nature. We were fishing for a species called the European eel. Many of you might know what an eel is. At that time, they were very abundant in all of European lakes and rivers. And just in the last 30 years, or since 1990, their population has dropped by over 90%. So a fish that was very common when I was a child is now a smuggled commodity that is protected by CITES. And a few years ago, some people were arrested in Paris at the airport, smuggling 300,000 baby eels to China. So that is not an unusual fate. Many species just in the last few decades have met that fate. So my love of nature is still with me, but now with a focus on turning around halting and reversing the loss and degradation of nature.
And if you reflect back on that time that you spent as a child roaming around freely in nature, fishing, to how you spend your days today, still honoring that love of nature, how has your relationship to nature evolved over time, and how is it present today in your life? And do you have any kind of habit or routine that helps you be connected to nature on a regular basis?
So about 3 years ago, my family and I, we bought an old farm here in Denmark. So I live and work on a farm, and though I talk quite a bit about it, it's actually my wife who runs the farm and is much more in nature than I am, because after all, I do have a job as a VP at a major tech company. And I still try to do as much as possible, though, on the farm with shifting what used to be a dairy farm. We have about 90 acres or 35 hectares. Shifting that from monoculture grassland to a more diverse grassland and agroforestry, so that we can graze the sheep underneath mostly chestnut and walnut trees in a few years, and establishing fruit orchards and trying to also regenerate the soil biodiversity with rotational grazing of the sheep. So I can see nature all the time out of my window, but also try to be out in nature as much as possible in an active way where we are part of nature. That's, to me, probably the most important aspect of my relationship to nature, that nature is not something that happens elsewhere, as most people think. We are part of nature, and we are ecosystem engineers, just like elephants or beavers. We're probably the most powerful ecosystem engineers the Earth has ever seen. So we need to use that power effectively for good.
Well, that's so beautiful, Tim. You mentioned that we are part of nature, and most people don't realize it. It's something also having to do with where we live, right? If you live in a big city where your life is about getting in the car, going into the office, having light all around you all night, you don't have that kind of observation that we are part of nature, and they seem quite similar. So unless we're living closer to nature, I think it's harder for people to viscerally feel this connection. At least for me, after COVID, I decided I no longer wanted to live in a big city, and I moved out to the mountains. I'm living in a small village in the Swiss Alps, and I cannot tell you how much it gives every day that I'm looking out, and it's a forest and it's the mountain peaks, and I see how nature lives and breathes, although putting it in caveat because it's a plantation forest here. It's not real wilderness anymore. What have you observed about that from that proximity of being in nature?
I don't want this to become too philosophical, but of course the question is, what is nature? Because when you say there is no nature in cities, first of all, that is a misperception that most people have. And you look at the categorization of biomes, there are several habitats that are classified as such that are city habitats that are completely man-made, like subterranean aquifers, also known as sewers, though they're classified as a habitat. Of course, that's not a part of nature that most of us think about when we think nature is beautiful and serene and wild. But nature is also the global life support system of planet Earth, or of spaceship Earth, right? If you want to use a more technical analogy for those of us who are more technically minded, that life support system is even more important in cities than it is in the countryside, because in cities you have a much higher demand on drinking water, on sewage systems, on import of food that has to come from nature. And as such, for people who live in cities, of course, their most immediate contact with nature is in what they eat, if they know it and if they realize it, and in what they drink, because all of that comes from nature, but also clean air and the air filtration of city forests and of urban green spaces is well documented. it takes a bit of a mind shift to see what is nature. Nature is never far away from you, even if you're in a big city. And the observation of the nature that is around you is maybe different in a city, but there are many bird species that have become accustomed to living in large cities. There are many species of mammals. There are, of course, lots of insects. So cities can be habitats just like any other part of nature. But of course, for all of us, I mean, I share that view that I'd also rather be in the countryside and see forests and fields and meadows and than confined green spaces in the city. What I would say, though, is that we always have to remember that if we are part of nature, we also bring nature with us everywhere. And we depend on nature wherever we are, even if you're in the middle of a multi-million people city.
So just before you moved to Denmark, you were based in Nairobi for many years at the equator. And there's a more subtle seasonal shift at the equator than we have in Europe here. How is your life now changing through the seasonality that we experience? And on a farm, that's probably very pronounced. But does it change your working life in any way?
It does. And also in Nairobi and Kenya, for those who know, it is a wonderful country. It has such an abundance of wildlife and wild beauty and national parks. So highly recommended for anybody who loves nature as a destination. In Denmark, I work for a company that is based in San Francisco. So my day is now mostly decided by time zone differences between San Francisco and Denmark. And that means I can often use the morning to do chores on the farm, to be outside, get up early as nature does in the summer. In the winter, things here are, of course, slower. Everything is slower in the European winter. And what I love about Northern Europe are the long summer evenings when the sun basically does not set, and you can have you can basically feel that nature is using every minute of daylight to produce and grow and create the resources needed to get through winter.
That's beautiful. Do you think you find yourself in a more slow paces work or contemplative place in the winter time, or do you have to balance the same kind of rhythm work-wise with the changing seasons?
Modern business world, the modern business world does not slow down in winter. I would say that is unfortunate because every living thing has this rhythm of activity and rest, of pace and slowness, of night and day, of birth and death. So that duality of life is built into everything we do as humans. And I think that rhythm and that pace is important, especially in our hemisphere, our part of the world here. And I think there is, of course, a time, especially during the shortest day and the longest night here in Denmark in December, when there is a lot of time for contemplation. And that has been the case here for humans as long as they've lived in this part of the world. That seasonality is with us. And I think that is still there, even though we keep the same working hours in December or June, and we have the same KPIs and the same deliverables. But I think there is still a natural rhythm to the year, and that does slow down in the winter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm really curious to hear about a time where you were out in nature and you just suddenly had an unexpected insight or a realization that changed your perspective on life. And maybe it impacted your belief system or your purpose. Could you recall an event like that?
I've had a couple of those events over the past months because when we took over this place, the farm 3 years ago, it was just like a very regular dairy farm. The land was actually leased out. The farm wasn't active anymore, but the land was over fertilized. There was very little soil biodiversity. So we started with digging out a lake on one of the fields. We planted about 30,000 trees in one of the other fields, planted a flower bed along one of the roads. And what surprised me and keeps surprising me is how quickly nature returns. We did some echolocation monitoring over the lake about 6 months after it had been established. There's about 15 species of bats in Denmark, and 8 of those were already circling over the lake at night, half a year after the lake hadn't been there before. And the same with many of the insects that came back to the flower bed that we put in alongside one of the roads with flowers for pollinators. And the same with birds that need permanent grassland to breed, that came back now to a grassland that is not disturbed. So all of that is to say that I keep being surprised how quickly nature bounces back, and that even species that you think are relatively rare, they are there. They're waiting for us to give them the chance to come back.
And Tim, we had our previous conversation on one of the challenges we face these days, which is this shifting baseline syndrome, that we don't actually know how wild and how rich in biodiversity a landscape can look like because we got accustomed to seeing it in a degraded form. Does this observation that you encountered of how quickly nature bounces back, does it give you some sort of hope regarding that?
Yeah, it absolutely does. It takes an intentional act by humans, though, to give nature that opportunity to bounce back. And often the intentionality that we bring to ecosystem restoration is important in terms of what is the goal that we have in mind. For many people I speak with, it's the end goal is ecological restoration. So they want nature to be as it was. But nature was never as it was. There's no such thing as nature as it was. Nature is in constant flux. So we have to define what nature we want. And since we're part of nature, that has to mean we want landscapes that have high biodiversity, but also a high functionality for our needs. They need to produce food, they need to produce clean water, they need to produce recreation. So the ecological state, let's say right after the ice age here in Denmark, is maybe not what we need to restore when we think about restoration. They're functioning landscapes with humans as ecosystem engineers, as elements of the landscape. And one story to illustrate that shifting baseline syndrome from South Africa, I was visiting a friend there in 2019 in the Eastern Cape, so just the area north of Port Elizabeth. And you drive through that landscape, which is about 1.3 million hectares. It's a vast, vast area, the Eastern Cape. It looks very dry. It looks like the typical savanna woodland that you think of when most people think of when they think of African savanna. So it's sort of brownish in color, and there's a few green spots of every few hundred meters. There's a tree that has withstood the drought. That area, though, was densely forested 200 years ago by ecosystem called the subtropical thicket. And there's a native tree species called the speckbone, which is a succulent plant that is the keystone plant species of that ecosystem. The whole landscape has been degraded over 150, 200 years, overgrazed basically for export of merino wool to Russia and to Europe. And when you think about that whole landscape being restored to a level where it is the best black rhino habitat in the world, the best big five habitat in the world, in fact, also for elephants and other wildlife, produces a lot of water for the surrounding cities, has much higher agricultural productivity because the droughts can be managed much better. It takes a lot of imagination to know what was there because there are no photos of that time, of that landscape. There's hardly anybody who knows that was there. So the first thing we need is imagination to know what 1 million hectares of landscape restoration would look like, because we have very few examples so far globally of that size.
Beautiful. I've actually been to that area, and we had a traditional medicine practitioner who joined our mission with the Eastern Cape Protected Areas Agency, and they really do focus a lot on older people's stories, and it's quite an incredible part of the world in terms of the changes that have been seen there, and how to access the traditional knowledge as far back as possible into that area. So,
can I just say on the Eastern Cape, make a link to my day job, because in 2019, when we looked at that area and were brainstorming how you could restore it, obviously there was no financing mechanism in sight. But since then, the voluntary carbon market has actually opened opportunities for that spec boom restoration at large scale. So in the same area that I visited in 2019, there's now a spec boom nursery that you can see from satellites. They employed 400 workers in an area where the unemployment rate is 70%. All of that only possible because of the voluntary carbon market. And I know that carbon compensation or carbon credits get a bad reputation often, but that is usually the few projects that are not well designed. There are many opportunities out there for companies like Salesforce and others to invest, in addition to their decarbonization, in nature, and is one of those finance streams that we really need to tap for restoration at large scale.
Wonderful. I think that's a great source of livelihood opportunities, and in that area, a lack of livelihood opportunities has driven a lot of out migration. But if there can be local livelihood opportunities, that's fantastic. Well, Tim, a few years ago, you had a major change in your career trajectory. So you were very firmly established as an environmental leader in the international public sector, in the international civil service. And you took the very brave choice to go into the private sector. So now a VP at Salesforce. How did your time in nature help you through this major change? And how does it influence how you show up as a leader today in the private sector?
My love of nature actually was part of the reason for making this change, because during COVID, the UN campus in Nairobi was locked down and it was unclear when we would be allowed to return to work. So my family and I, we went to Europe for a while to be with our aging parents and and the rest of my family, and had for the first time the opportunity to realize this lifelong dream that my wife and I have had for more than 20 years now, to buy and manage a farm. And when the discussions with Salesforce, when they approached me and I said, well, but I want to work remotely, I want to work from my farm, they said, no problem. So it was a very good combination of making that shift to driving change from within the private sector, but also the opportunity to realize this lifelong dream, to restore our part of nature, and hopefully over the coming years also show that there's a different way of farming. There's a lot of talk about regenerative farming and what that is and what that means. For our family, it also means a regeneration of the lifestyle that is more connected with nature. Farming, where the farmer and the farming family is part of nature and part of the landscape. Not everything is outsourced and there's not a lot of external inputs, but there's a lot more localized knowledge and local building on nature's power and nature as an ally.
That's so well said, and I'm happy you brought this up because I think often that kind of flexibility from the workspace of allowing people to work from where they want to, it can be a really big help in establishing that connection to nature. And the example that you say about the farming family, I mean, a farm is a demanding place, especially during the summer months. It really needs daily care and attention and nurturing. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit on how do you balance the demands of your career with the need for that time in nature.
So this only works because it's a family project, and even our kids have to help out on the farm with varying degrees of enthusiasm. But the 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 demands of my respect for anybody who farms in the world has grown by leaps and bounds and is still growing daily. This is not only a hard job, but it's also extremely risky because you're at the mercy of the elements. It is extremely knowledge intensive, the local biodiversity and how species interact and what to plant when. It is very knowledge intensive in terms of marketing and many different skill sets. So I think it's probably one of the most fascinating careers that you could imagine, to live on and work the land. Unfortunately, there's a bit of an aging problem amongst European farmers. There's not a lot of young people who want to move in this field because it is seen as too risky and too hard. And I think the society has a role to play here in helping farmers buffer that risk and be paid for the ecosystem services that we all depend on, like biodiversity and clean water, carbon storage, clean air. Shifting all that agricultural subsidy in the EU, that's 40 billion euros a year, towards producing what our society needs on top of sufficient amounts of food is, I think, one of the big political projects of this decade on ecosystem restoration. And fortunately, that is a big step that happened last month with the adoption of the EU nature restoration law, that EU countries now have to have binding targets for 20% of restoration of their degraded area. There's one thing that worries me in that, though, is that there's still this separation in our minds and in most farmers and in most politicians' minds, that intensive farming is over here and then nature is over there. And we're not going to win in that way because even less percentage of area highly intensely managed, I think there are about 17 million pigs in Denmark, for example, will produce too much nutrient runoff. It will produce too much air pollution. We have to integrate farming and nature restoration through regenerative farming. That's the only way forward.
Mm. And Tim, that really resonates. In my previous job, did a study on regenerative agriculture, and we visited pioneering farmers in France who adopted regenerative agriculture before it was a trend. And I was absolutely fascinated, as you said, by the diversity of their knowledge and the depth of that knowledge. And I thought, wow, these people are the ultimate entrepreneurs. I mean, you have to learn about so many diverse subjects and become good at it and put your livelihood at risk of making the right decisions. That I was truly fascinated. And I think it should be, as you said, valued much more in economic terms as well, of what these farmers do.
It also has to be easier, to finance the transition costs.
Yeah.
Coming back to our example here, planting all these chestnut and walnut species, and of course that will be a more productive ecosystem, more productive landscape in a few years, but for 10 years, they are not going to produce any nuts or fruits, and we still have to pay for the trees this year. So it should be possible for people to do that without having a well-paid job outside of the farm. But at present, that is not possible. These transaction costs, or the transition costs for farmers, should be supported by society at large, because otherwise farmers have difficulties to raise that capital for the necessary transition.
I mean, I know you as a quite highly innovative leader. You're really thinking about how to change systems, how to create new mechanisms for financing. How do you think being in nature, the time you spend there, has inspired you in your problem solving or in the way you innovate in your career?
So nature can inspire all of us to be systems thinkers because nature is the greatest systems thinker. It's like the difference between throwing a stone and throwing a live bird. You don't know where in systems thinking the bird will end up unless you know all the parameters and you have a much wider view, not only of the solution, but also of the problem. Not that I recommend throwing live birds, but the crisis we're in is a polycrisis. We have the climate crisis, we have the biodiversity crisis, we have a pollution crisis, we have a crisis of inequality. So single solver solutions are both not adequate, but they're also not fast enough. We need multi-solver solutions for that polycrisis. And that means you have to have a systems approach. And you can see that everywhere in nature. Nature always thinks in systems, never in linear, one problem, one solution, one fix. And sometimes it's surprising how quickly nature bounces back to that systems thinking, but it also is a risk for our civilization because the systems thinking also means there are ecological tipping points. Nature doesn't change in linear ways either. It changes in very sudden, very dramatic shifts of ecosystem condition from one stable equilibrium state to another. So when people talk about ecological tipping points, you see that in small examples, but there are, of course, big tipping points that we're all worried about, like the Amazon forest, the Amazon biome flipping to a savanna woodland state. And that could happen relatively quickly and at a point that is very difficult to predict. So we have to use also the precautionary principle in our approach and learn that from nature, because these changes can happen very suddenly and sometimes unexpectedly.
Great. I wanted to go back to the generational point that you made around, there's aging farmers and, the need to make running a farm more appealing to young people. And I'm from a farming family in southwestern Ontario in Canada. And I noticed actually a lot of incentives for renewable energy. So renewable energy like wind turbines and solar is actually making it, more appealing to run a farm. And then during COVID, a lot of people moved out of cities and they actually wanted to move to rural areas. So that started to stimulate maybe, breweries or artisanal restaurants and things like that start to bring customers. And I wonder if, we might see the EU nature restoration law starting to create incentives for rewilding of farms. Do you have any thoughts on what this could look like? Could this be, a horizon for making more exciting opportunities for younger people in rural areas around Europe?
What I love about the entire restoration discussion and regenerative farming and regeneration is that it provides a positive antidote to climate anxiety and despair and doomism, because that is not helpful on any level. You cannot shock people into action, really. I mean, I learned that after 20 years in the UN, where we put out report after report about the dire state of the climate and nature. But what is necessary is to paint a positive vision of the future that polls people, and that positive vision has to include how can people live in rural areas, because many people want to live in the countryside, but there have to be incentives and there has to be a vision for that kind of lifestyle. And of course, with the availability of high-speed internet connections in many rural areas, there are so many more opportunities. Now, with the emergence of AI as well, many jobs will, again, drastically change, but it could be a great opportunity to focus on the things that are really important for humans to focus on and to do, both in their personal lives and personal growth and professionally, while leaving a lot of mundane tasks to AI in the future. And that also goes for agriculture. Of course, the hardest part of agriculture, and when you grow vegetables, for example, is weeding. And there are new technology, there's new technology and tools where that can in part be taken over by AI. So you can in future hopefully do the part of farming that is fun, which is designing and planning and working with the animals and with being in nature, being in the landscape. But the back-breaking part of it can hopefully partly be more mechanized in the future.
Sounds great.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for those machines. It's a very theoretical concept for now. But if you have the right size, one of our neighbors is one of Denmark's largest organic food producers, and he has one of those very fancy and probably expensive new machines that identify weeds with AI and then shoot them with a laser. And you could say that sounds awful, but I think it's, first of all, much better than using pesticides. You could, of course, ask if that is the best way for diversity on farms, but it does help to keep the cost of organic farming down. It does help him to produce large amounts of food at a very competitive price. So we have to embrace that aspect of technology and how it can help us do the right thing. That's always what technology throughout human history has been designed for often. It's often been used for not the right purpose. And the same goes now with artificial intelligence. It has huge opportunities, also has huge risks, and we need to navigate it well based on the right principles.
Tim, it's so great to hear you think about the future and to touch on that point that we need to generate a sense of optimism. That's what really gets people into action, that they feel that they can make a difference. How do you envision a future relationship between humans and nature in the long distance or within our few generations' lifetime?
So when we designed the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration strategy with the UN team, we were thinking about what should be at the heart of that decade. And it's actually not a billion hectares of restored landscapes. It's the repaired or the restored relationship between us and nature. We're in a relationship crisis. And if you're in a relationship crisis with nature, it's not only about what you do. It is also about how you think and how you feel and your attitude towards each other. So I think that shift in perception of our attitude towards nature is at least as important as shifting our behavior. And I think it has to come first. We first have to understand that we're not outside and we're definitely not above nature. We are part of nature. As soon as we realize that, everything else will make more sense. For example, this movement to give legal rights to entire ecosystems or to non-human species, or to ensure that we have decision-making that takes all the actors in a landscape into account. So I think that shift in perception of our role is one of the next big steps in human evolution. Caring for the planet that until now has just cared for us and not the other way around, at least not very much. That is a big step in human evolution. That takes a collective humankind mind shift.
You know, one of my most fascinating meetings in New York Climate Week last year was meeting this NGO, Earth Law Center, who works to put the voice of nature on corporate boards and governance. And they have a legal framework on how you can do that. And they have these incredible stories recounting how that changes the dialogue altogether in terms of what decisions are being made. Because what is the type of decision that you make when you have the ocean on the board? And you have to take that perspective into account.
Yeah, that's a fascinating approach, and I follow that as well. And you might have also seen that on Spotify, there's now an artist called Nature that you can follow, and where some of the payments go into nature conservation and restoration projects. Giving nature a seat at the table is absolutely essential, alongside with then also paying for what we use from nature. I think that's the main shift in how we can repair at least that part of our relationship with nature. There's a long study called the Dasgupta Review a few years ago. I think it's 600 pages of dense economic writing, but it boils down to pay for what you use. That's the one message of those 600 pages, where nature has not only been invisible or not present in key decision-making circles and hasn't had a seat at the table, nature is also invisible in our economic decision-making. So giving nature that seat at the table will hopefully also change that visibility. What are the ecosystem services that we take for granted, but that have to be financed at the same level as critical infrastructure for humanity, at the multi-billion-dollar peatland rewetting, reforestation, and many other ecosystem restoration projects that need to be initiated and need to be funded at an adequate level. I think as soon as we have nature at the table, that will make more economic sense than it does now.
Yeah, and all the natural capital accounting initiatives and how we can account for the value of those goods and services that are being taken for granted. I think it's also going to be extremely important to get right in the next few years.
Yeah, that is absolutely key. If we estimate a $1 trillion funding gap for nature between now and 2030, there are of course different estimates. This is one of the work that Jessica and colleagues have been pioneering, but it is important to shift our mindset towards seeing nature as a relationship that goes both ways, and that means we receive a lot of benefits from nature. We have to give back. That reciprocity is, I think, the major shift that needs to happen in our human mindsets.
So, Tim, you spoke about this as a relationship issue between nature and humans. How do we change our relationship with nature today? What are the most immediate steps we can take as individuals?
The first step is observation. This might seem counterintuitive, and it's not actually something that is very difficult, but it does require spending some time observing nature, whether it's in a city park or just outside of your window or taking a walk in the forest. We have a great opportunity because during COVID, many people did that for the first time. Millions of people did that because it was the only safe place to be, where you could still see other people but not be in danger. It was outside in the fresh air and nature, going for walks. And I think we can build on that baseline of many people's realization that nature is a space that is important beyond what we normally take for granted, and also understanding all the things that nature provides. So we have to take nature seriously. Think about, your relationships with any human being or a family. It always starts with respect and taking the other person serious.
That's beautiful. And the last question, Tim, that we would like to hear is, what is the greatest lesson that nature has personally taught you?
Oh, I learn lessons from nature every day, so it's hard to pick a most important lesson. But I'll go back to my childhood and say that the most important lesson for me still is that there are many things that we don't yet understand. We think we have it all figured out. We live a very science-driven and very secular world. And that has led us to an enormous hubris as humans. But there's a nice quote from Arthur Schopenhauer, philosopher, who said that every boy can step on a beetle, but all the professors in the world cannot put one together.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think we have to check ourselves and say, well, how much do we actually know about our planet and life on it, including our own role on it? So that humility is the most important lesson.
That's beautiful. And if we fix that, we also fix that extractivist mindset that just wants to dominate nature, and we could start healing that relationship to it.
I think so, yes.
Well, thank you, Tim. Just to close us out, we have a quick fire round of questions. So we have 4 quick questions for you that we're going to ask the same to all guests. And so first of all, what is your favorite place in nature?
Always a forest. Forests are my favorite place to be.
And where is one place in nature that you would like to visit, but you haven't been to yet?
Greenland. Most fascinating place also throughout the climate history, and that it is called Greenland because at some point it was green and people lived there and farmed potatoes during Viking peak time of Viking expansion, and that place of wildness, as most people understand it, of remote and vast and stunning natural beauty, I would love to visit. I've not been there.
Great. And do you have a favorite piece of art, a book, poetry, or a film that you feel really connects you to nature?
There are many. I love a movie called The Biggest Little Farm, not surprisingly, because that's sort of what we try to do here as well. That explains that regenerative relationship that farmers can have with the land and how important it is that we make that transition to agriculture, because we've come to the end of the road. So the Biggest Little Farm is with us here on the farm every day also.
And what is one thing you would recommend to listeners that they can do to connect better to nature?
Spend more time outside and try to observe, because spending time outside also means opening all your senses and try to observe with more than your eyes and your ears and your nose. Try to absorb with all the senses that we have as humans, and there are ways of understanding and immersing yourself in nature that goes beyond our physical senses.
Thank you so much. That's been very insightful.
Thanks again for having me, and I love the title of this podcast. It's amazing.
So that was a fantastic interview with Tim. It didn't come up, but actually Tim had been one of my supervisors when he was in the UN. But I never got that depth of insight, on his personal engagement with nature. So I just thought it was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, and look, I really love the kind of humility that comes across his thinking, and that he recommends us all to just observe nature and to really take it in with all our senses, because what it will teach us is that we know still so little about our place in the universe and how nature so beautifully has designed systems that we're not even coming close to, and take inspiration from that.
So in Tim's role at Salesforce, they're investing a lot into the voluntary carbon market, and the fact that Tim is there with his really strong foundation in nature and ecosystem restoration gives me a lot of confidence. So I felt, coming away, he's making change on so many levels in the world, in the corporate space and really locally on his farm.
Yeah, that connection to the farm is really beautiful. I actually laughed when he said his kids had to take part with various degrees of enthusiasm. I don't know their age, but they probably don't realize what a beautiful gift this is to them to establish that direct connection to the land that they are living on.
Great. Well, another episode. This has been Executives in the Wild with Tim Christophersen as our guest.
Executives in the Wild is created by Diana Denke, Jessica Smith, and Robin Agustin. Those involved in the podcast are doing so in a personal capacity, and views expressed are not necessarily associated with their employers. You can follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram at Executives in the Wild, or go to executivesinthewild.com where you can sign up to be a part of our community. Please support us by subscribing and sharing this podcast, available on YouTube and most outlets including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.